Her cry echoed across the street, and the rancher's next move stopped the town. Cold, the town of Willow Creek, was one of those places where life moved slowly, where mornings were greeted by the crowing of roosters rather than the blare of traffic, and where everyone knew everyone else's name. The streets were lined with a mix of small houses, a few shops, and the occasional open field stretching toward the hills. It was the kind of town where people left their doors unlocked, where children played freely in the yards, and where strangers were immediately noticed because they didn't belong. Most of the time, nothing remarkable happened in Willow Creek, and its residents liked it that way. The town's quietness gave people a sense of safety, a feeling that at least here, life could be predictable. Among the residents was Martha, a schoolteacher in her late 20s, who lived alone in a modest house at the edge of town. Her home was small but cozy, with a garden that she tended herself, full of flowers and vegetables. Martha was kind, gentle, and known by everyone in town for her warm smile and her dedication to the children she taught. She enjoyed her simple life, rising early to prepare lessons, walking to school along the quiet streets, and returning home in the evenings to read, cook, or take care of her garden. She was someone the townspeople trusted, someone who had always followed the rules, and someone who had never asked for trouble. Across the street from Martha's house was the ranch owned by Henry, a man in his late 50s. Henry had lived in Willow Creek all his life and had a reputation that commanded respect. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a face lined by years of sun, wind, and hard work. He was known as a man of few words, sometimes appearing stern or even intimidating to those who didn't know him well. But those who did know Henry understood that his heart was as big as his hands, that he had a strong sense of justice, and that he would do anything to protect his neighbors. His ranch was expansive, with grazing land for his cattle and a barn filled with tools, hay, and memories of decades of work. On most days, he could be found tending to his animals, repairing fences, or riding his old horse across the fields. It was an ordinary afternoon in Willow Creek. The sun hung high in the sky, warming the streets and the rooftops, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass. Children played on the sidewalks, their laughter mixing with the distant lowing of cows from the ranch. Birds chirped from the trees lining the yards, and the townspeople went about their daily routines, exchanging greetings and pleasantries. Everything seemed peaceful, just as it always did. Martha had spent the morning grading papers and preparing her lesson plans for the next day. By the time she stepped outside to water her garden, the quietness of the afternoon made her feel safe and content. She enjoyed the solitude of her yard, the way the sun touched the flowers, and the occasional hum of a passing car or the neigh of a horse from across the street. She liked living where she did because it felt like a little world of her own, separate from the noise and chaos of larger towns or cities. But then, without warning, the calm was shattered. A scream pierced the quiet of Willow Creek. It was sharp, urgent, and filled with fear. It echoed across the street, bouncing off the houses and carrying down the empty streets. The scream was so loud and sudden that it made people freeze in their tracks. Some dropped the groceries they were carrying. Others paused mid-step, staring toward the sound in shock. The children stopped playing, their laughter replaced by wide-eyed silence. Martha herself was trembling. She had barely registered what had happened before she realized the sound had come from her own house. She spun around to see the source, her heart pounding in her chest. There, standing in her yard, she could see shadows moving near her front door. Her hands shook as she called out, but no one answered. It wasn't just fear, it was disbelief. She had always felt safe in her home, and yet, in that instant, everything she had believed about her little world seemed to crumble. Across the street, Henry noticed the commotion immediately. He was tending to his cattle when he saw Martha's figure in the yard and the shadows near her door. Something inside him shifted, and without hesitation, he dropped what he was doing. His years of experience on the ranch, managing unpredictable animals, facing sudden dangers, and making split-second decisions, kicked in. He didn't panic. He didn't shout. He simply moved, his steps deliberate and calm, heading straight for the source of the disturbance. The neighbors began to emerge from their homes, drawn by the scream and the sudden tension in the air. Windows opened, doors creaked, and soon a small crowd gathered, unsure of what was happening but unable to look away. Whispers filled the air. "Did you hear that? What's going on over there? Is she okay?" Everyone was filled with a mix of fear and curiosity. None of them had ever seen anything like this in Willow Creek before. Martha's cries continued, desperate and raw. She pointed toward her front door, and the neighbors could see a figure trying to force entry. Her voice, though trembling, was full of urgency. "Help! Someone, please!" she shouted. The scream echoed off the empty streets, louder and more haunting with each repetition. It was a sound that carried the weight of fear, a sound that demanded attention, a sound that would not be ignored. Henry's approach was steady. He didn't rush recklessly, but he moved with purpose. The crowd parted slightly as he walked between them, his presence commanding yet calm. People whispered his name, surprised that he was the one taking action. Some had always thought of him as gruff, unapproachable, or distant. But now, seeing him move toward danger without hesitation, they realized that Henry was something else entirely. He was someone who had lived a life full of challenges, someone who knew how to handle unexpected threats, someone who had a sense of responsibility that could not be shaken. Martha, meanwhile, felt a flicker of hope as she saw Henry approaching. She didn't know exactly what he would do, but she knew he was different from the rest of the townspeople. She had always seen him across the street, working with his animals, keeping to himself, and sometimes offering advice or help quietly. But now, in her moment of fear, she realized that Henry's calmness might be the thing that would save her. The intruder, unaware of Henry's presence at first, struggled with the front door. There was panic in his movements, a lack of control that only made Martha's fear grow. But Henry did not rush in recklessly. He assessed the situation, noting the intruder's movements, the layout of Martha's yard, and the reactions of the neighbors. Everything in him, the years of ranching, the understanding of danger, the instinct to protect, guided his next steps. As he stepped closer, the crowd watched in a mixture of awe and fear. No one had ever seen Henry act like this in public. Usually, he was quiet, reserved, and somewhat intimidating. But now, he was a figure of calm authority, moving toward a potential threat with confidence and purpose. It was a scene that would be remembered by everyone who witnessed it, a moment where ordinary life collided with sudden danger, and where one man's courage began to shine through the chaos. Martha's voice continued to carry across the street, trembling but persistent. She clutched at the edge of her dress, feeling a mixture of fear and relief. She knew help had arrived, even if she didn't yet know what form it would take. And then she saw Henry reach the edge of her yard. He stopped for just a moment, assessing, watching, calculating. In that brief pause, time seemed to stretch, and the entire town held its breath. The ordinary afternoon had turned into a scene of tension, fear, and anticipation. The quiet streets of Willow Creek, usually so predictable and safe, were now filled with whispers, anxious eyes, and the lingering sound of a woman's desperate cries. And at the center of it all was Henry, the rancher across the street, moving with calm authority, ready to take the next step that would change the course of the day, and perhaps the lives of everyone in the small town. The intruder's movements were clumsy and panicked. He tried to force open Martha's front door, but it didn't budge. Every failed attempt made him more desperate, and every creak of the hinges echoed through the quiet streets of Willow Creek. Martha's fear intensified with each sound. Her hands shook, and her legs felt weak as she backed away from the door, her eyes darting from the intruder to the street. She wanted to scream again, but her voice felt stuck in her throat. She realized that no matter how loud she called, the only person who could help her now was Henry, the rancher across the street. Henry had stopped at the edge of Martha's yard and was observing the intruder closely. His eyes were steady, not filled with fear or anger, but with careful attention. Years of dealing with unpredictable animals had taught him how to stay calm under pressure. Now, that same calm guided him as he watched the man struggling with the door. He could see the tension in the intruder's shoulders, the unsteady rhythm of his breathing, and the way panic was controlling his actions. Henry knew that acting too quickly or too aggressively could make the situation worse. He needed a plan. The neighbors, meanwhile, had gathered in a semicircle along the street, unsure of what to do. Some whispered urgently to one another, their voices trembling with anxiety. "Should we call the police?" one woman asked. "Do we try to help her?" another said. Children peeked from behind their parents' legs, their eyes wide with fear. The town that had always prided itself on safety and calm was suddenly filled with tension and uncertainty. Every resident felt the same fear that Martha did, the fear that life as they knew it could be shattered in a single moment. Martha, trembling in her yard, tried to steady herself. She reminded herself to breathe, though each inhale felt shallow and tight. She could feel the adrenaline pumping through her body, making her heart race and her hands shake uncontrollably. She thought about all the times she had walked home alone, all the nights she had felt completely safe in her little house, and she realized just how quickly that sense of safety could vanish. Fear had a way of magnifying every sound and every shadow, and right now, every creak of the door sounded like an explosion in her ears. Henry took another step forward, closer to the intruder, and the man finally noticed him. The intruder froze for a moment, his eyes widening as he realized he was being watched. It was clear that he had not expected anyone to interfere so quickly. Henry's calm, deliberate approach startled him. The man's panic escalated. He began moving frantically, trying to find another way in, but the front of the house offered no easy entry. He glanced toward the street and saw the neighbors, their faces filled with worry and fear. For the first time, he realized that the entire town was watching him. Martha's voice rang out again, though it was shaky and weak. "Stop, please, just stop," she called, her desperation audible to everyone. She wanted to believe that Henry would handle the situation, that he could somehow make everything safe again. And as she watched him, a small spark of hope flickered inside her. Henry wasn't rushing in recklessly. He was moving with purpose, with a quiet confidence that suggested he knew exactly what he was doing. That confidence gave Martha the courage to take a small step back from the door, putting some distance between herself and the intruder. The intruder, now realizing he could not easily enter the house, began pacing nervously. He muttered to himself under his breath, his words incoherent and filled with frustration. Every movement seemed more desperate than the last, and Henry continued to approach, slowly closing the distance without provoking him. The rancher's calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the man's frantic energy. It was almost as if the intruder's panic was magnified by Henry's composure. The townspeople could feel the tension building, each second stretching longer than the last as they waited to see what would happen next. Henry finally spoke, his voice low but firm, carrying across the yard. "It's okay. Calm down. Nobody's going to hurt you if you stop this now." His words were deliberate, measured, and meant to de-escalate the situation. He didn't shout, didn't make sudden movements, and didn't approach too quickly. Instead, he relied on the quiet authority that came from years of handling unpredictable and sometimes dangerous situations on his ranch. The intruder hesitated, clearly unsure how to respond. The man's breathing remained erratic, but Henry's calm had a subtle effect, making him pause just enough to give the rancher an opportunity to act safely. The neighbors watched in silence. Some could hardly believe what they were seeing. Henry, who had always seemed distant or stern, was now taking charge in a way that made the entire town hold its breath. It wasn't just his physical presence that was commanding attention. It was the way he carried himself, the quiet confidence, and the sense that he was in control even in a chaotic moment. Children clung to their parents' legs, their eyes wide, while adults whispered among themselves, trying to understand what they were witnessing. Martha, still trembling, began to feel a mixture of fear and relief. She didn't know exactly what Henry would do, but seeing him move toward the intruder with such control reassured her. For the first time since the scream echoed across the street, she felt a glimmer of hope. Henry was not only protecting her, he was preventing the situation from escalating further. His presence alone seemed to slow the intruder's frantic movements, forcing him to reconsider his actions. Minutes passed, though it felt much longer to everyone watching. The intruder's energy began to wane slightly, his desperation still present but less uncontrolled. Henry continued to speak in calm, steady tones, reassuring the man while maintaining a safe distance. "You don't have to do this. Stop now and nobody will get hurt," he said again. The intruder's eyes darted around, looking for an escape or a way to regain control, but the rancher's presence dominated the space. Henry's years of experience in reading animals, predicting their next move, and managing tense situations now applied perfectly to this human crisis. Then Henry took another careful step forward, closing the gap just enough to assert control without causing the intruder to panic. His hands were relaxed at his sides, but his posture communicated authority. The intruder's eyes widened further, and for a moment, time seemed to freeze. Martha held her breath, the neighbors stared, and the entire street waited for what would happen next. Finally, the intruder hesitated, his frantic movements slowing. Henry's calm had worked. The man began to realize that he was outnumbered not by force, but by composure and presence. He was no longer in control of the situation. Henry was. It was a delicate balance, a test of patience and understanding, and the rancher handled it with skill. He continued to speak softly, giving instructions and reassurance, guiding the intruder toward a decision that would prevent harm. At last, the intruder's panic reached a breaking point, and he froze completely. Henry moved in closer, ready to ensure that no sudden actions could cause danger. With steady hands and careful movements, he guided the man away from the door, keeping both him and Martha safe. The neighbors watched, amazed at how quietly and efficiently Henry had taken control. It wasn't a dramatic fight or a violent confrontation. It was a demonstration of patience, understanding, and careful action. Martha, still trembling, stepped back to give Henry space. She felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. In that moment, she realized how fragile safety could be, and how important it was to have someone like Henry nearby. The intruder was now fully aware that he could not continue, and Henry's calm authority had prevented a dangerous situation from turning into a tragedy. By the time the local authorities arrived, the intruder was restrained, and Martha was safe. Henry's actions had not only protected her, but had prevented panic from spreading further through the town. The quiet streets of Willow Creek, once again, began to feel safe, but the memory of the afternoon lingered. Residents whispered about what they had seen, amazed at how one man's calm courage had turned a frightening incident into a story of control and careful decision-making. It was a day that would be remembered in Willow Creek for years. Martha's scream had drawn attention, yes, but it was Henry's response that became the story. The town had witnessed something extraordinary. A man who remained composed in the face of fear, who took control without violence, and who protected a neighbor with quiet determination. It was a lesson for everyone about courage, presence of mind, and the difference that one calm, thoughtful individual could make in a crisis. After the intruder was guided safely away from the door, the tension in the street did not immediately disappear. The townspeople of Willow Creek remained rooted to their spots, their eyes fixed on the scene, still processing what had just happened. Shock mixed with relief, and whispers filled the air as everyone tried to make sense of the frightening incident. No one had ever imagined that such an event could unfold in their quiet town. For Martha, the feeling of vulnerability lingered, her hands still trembling as she clutched at the edge of her dress. Her heart raced, and her mind refused to slow down. The scream that had echoed across the street only moments ago still seemed to linger in the air. Henry stood a few feet from the intruder, his gaze calm but alert. Even though the immediate danger had passed, he knew the situation was far from over. A person who had acted so recklessly could react again, and the last thing he wanted was for panic to spread further. His attention remained focused on both Martha and the man in front of him. He spoke again, his voice measured, firm yet gentle. "Take a deep breath." "Let's figure this out calmly," he said. His tone was steady, almost hypnotic in its effect. The intruder, still tense and shaking, hesitated but seemed to respond to Henry's presence. The rancher's ability to stay composed under pressure was beginning to diffuse the immediate fear that had gripped the street. The neighbors, though still wary, began to relax slightly as they observed Henry's handling of the situation. Their eyes followed every careful movement, noting how he didn't rush, didn't raise his voice, and didn't escalate the confrontation. It was a striking contrast to the chaos they had feared. Some whispered among themselves, expressing disbelief and admiration. "He's not even scared," one woman murmured. "I don't know how he does it," another added. Children who had been hiding behind parents' legs peeked out cautiously, sensing that the danger was being managed. For many of them, it was a moment that blurred the line between fear and awe, leaving them with a mix of respect and curiosity. Martha, still near her yard, tried to regain her composure. Her hands were no longer trembling as violently, though her chest still ached from the adrenaline and fear. She looked at Henry with gratitude that words could barely express. She had feared the worst when the scream escaped her lips, but now she realized that not all heroes wore dramatic uniforms or rushed recklessly into danger. Some, like Henry, moved with quiet precision and careful control, achieving results without panic or chaos. In that moment, Martha felt a renewed sense of trust, not just in Henry, but in the possibility that calm courage could overcome even the most frightening circumstances. The intruder, now somewhat calmer but still uncertain, glanced around at the neighbors who had gathered. He noticed the fear in their eyes, the mixture of shock and relief, and he realized that his actions had drawn far more attention than he had anticipated. Henry's steady presence had not only protected Martha but had also contained the situation, preventing further panic. The man's energy, once frenzied and uncontrollable, began to ebb slightly as he recognized that the outcome was no longer in his hands. He could no longer rely on surprise or intimidation. The townspeople were watching, and Henry was in command. Henry took another step forward, maintaining a safe distance but asserting his authority. His eyes never left the intruder and his voice remained calm. "You don't have to do this. It's not too late to stop. Let's resolve this without anyone getting hurt," he said. The intruder's shoulders tensed, and he seemed on the verge of running, but Henry's composed demeanor prevented any rash action. It was clear that the man was grappling with fear, guilt, and uncertainty all at once. For Henry, it was a delicate balance, keeping the intruder calm while ensuring the safety of Martha and everyone nearby. As the minutes passed, the town's collective anxiety slowly shifted from fear to cautious observation. People whispered among themselves, sharing what they had seen, trying to understand how Henry could remain so composed. His actions were methodical, almost like watching a skilled craftsman at work. He assessed the intruder's every movement, predicted his reactions, and adjusted his own position accordingly. For the neighbors, it was a lesson in patience, courage, and the power of quiet authority. Unlike dramatic scenes in movies, this real-life moment was tense precisely because it was grounded in reality. Every second counted, and one wrong move could have changed everything. Martha finally took a few steps closer to her yard's edge, her courage slowly returning. She wanted to help, to somehow contribute, but she knew that any sudden movement could make things worse. So she stayed still, letting Henry lead. Every small action he took was measured, intentional, and aimed at reducing risk. The intruder, now standing still and breathing heavily, began to seem less like a threat and more like a frightened man caught in a situation he could not control. It was Henry's calmness that created this shift, allowing the tension to ease slightly while maintaining control over the scene. The intruder's eyes darted between Henry, Martha, and the gathered neighbors. He realized that running or resisting could only make the situation worse. The town was no longer just a backdrop. It was an audience, silently observing, waiting for the outcome. Henry's presence, his unwavering attention, and his careful guidance were slowly reshaping the intruder's mindset. He began to respond, hesitating before each movement, waiting for cues, and allowing Henry to direct the situation without resistance. In the crowd, murmurs of admiration grew. People began to recognize the skill it took to manage such a volatile situation without raising one hand in anger. Some nodded to each other quietly, impressed that a man so ordinary in appearance could command attention and respect simply by remaining calm and thoughtful. Children who had once clung to their parents now watched with wide eyes, perhaps learning a lesson about courage and composure they would carry with them for the rest of their lives. Henry then spoke again, a soft but firm reminder. "Nobody wants trouble here. Let's end this safely," he said, his voice carrying authority but no threat. The intruder seemed to shrink slightly under the weight of those words, his energy further drained by the realization that there was no escape through aggression or panic. Henry's method was simple: patience, observation, and steady guidance. It was a skill that had been honed over decades of handling unpredictable situations on the ranch, and it now applied perfectly to the human crisis unfolding in front of him. Meanwhile, the neighbors continued to watch, some holding their breath, others whispering encouragement to Martha. There was a shared sense of awe that someone could handle fear and uncertainty with such skill. The scene had shifted from panic to controlled tension, and every person present could feel the change. It was as if the storm of fear had passed its peak, and now calm determination was guiding the outcome. Martha, slowly regaining her voice, spoke again, her words quivering but sincere. Thank you for helping me," she said, glancing toward Henry. He gave a small nod but did not speak. His focus remained on the intruder, ensuring that the man understood he had no choice but to comply. It was a moment of unspoken trust, a recognition that calm, deliberate action could protect lives more effectively than force or panic. The intruder, now visibly exhausted and aware of his limited options, finally took a step backward, his hands slightly raised in a gesture of surrender. Henry maintained his position, giving the man room while ensuring that Martha and the neighbors were safe. It was a delicate dance, one that required careful attention to timing, movement, and human behavior. Every step mattered, and Henry executed it flawlessly, demonstrating that courage was not always loud or dramatic. It could also be quiet, precise, and incredibly effective. By the time local authorities arrived, the situation had already been diffused. The intruder was calm enough to be safely restrained, Martha was protected, and the neighbors could begin to process what had just occurred. Henry's actions had prevented what could have been a dangerous escalation, and his presence had turned a terrifying moment into one of controlled resolution. People whispered their amazement, realizing that the rancher's skill, patience, and composure had made all the difference. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the street, the townspeople slowly returned to their routines, still talking quietly about what they had witnessed. Martha, though shaken, felt a deep sense of gratitude and relief. The intruder had been contained, and the quiet of Willow Creek was slowly returning. Yet the memory of Henry's calm courage lingered, leaving a lasting impression on everyone who had seen it firsthand. It was a day that would be remembered for years, not for the fear or the danger, but for the quiet heroism displayed in the middle of an ordinary afternoon. Henry had shown the town that bravery was not always about action or confrontation. It could also be about calmness, observation, and steady guidance. And for Martha, the experience had been life-changing. She had witnessed firsthand the power of presence, patience, and courage, lessons she would carry with her long after the sun had set on that unforgettable day. After the immediate danger had passed and the intruder was restrained, a quiet settled over the street. But the calm was different now. It was layered with tension, relief, and anticipation. The neighbors, who had been frozen with fear just moments earlier, began to whisper among themselves, still unsure how to process everything they had witnessed. The town of Willow Creek, usually so predictable and slow-paced, had just experienced something extraordinary. It was not the kind of day anyone would forget. Martha, standing near the edge of her yard, was still trembling. The adrenaline that had fueled her fear now left her body weak, but her mind was slowly trying to catch up to the reality of what had happened. Henry stood quietly, a few steps away from her, his expression calm yet watchful. Though the immediate danger was over, his work was not done. His years on the ranch had taught him that situations like this rarely ended neatly. People could panic, emotions could flare, and the consequences could spread far beyond the initial incident if left unchecked. Henry's instinct told him that this was a critical moment, not just for Martha, but for the entire town. How he handled the aftermath would shape everyone's memory of what had happened, and he wanted it to be a lesson in safety, composure, and trust. Martha, finally able to catch her breath, turned to Henry with gratitude in her eyes. "I don't even know what to say, thank you," she whispered. Her voice was weak, but sincere, filled with the kind of relief that comes from knowing a life-threatening situation has been avoided. Henry simply nodded, acknowledging her thanks without fanfare. Words were not necessary, his actions had already spoken volumes. For Martha, that silent gesture carried more weight than any speech could. It was a reminder that courage sometimes needed no applause. It only required calm, careful action when it mattered most. The neighbors began to relax slightly, though some still lingered near the street, uncertain of what to do next. Children slowly emerged from hiding, their wide eyes scanning the scene. Some of the adults whispered to each other, recounting what they had seen and marveling at the rancher's composure. "I can't believe he stayed so calm," one man said quietly. "He didn't panic at all, and that's what saved her." Others nodded in agreement, recognizing that Henry's skill and patience had prevented what could have been a serious tragedy. In a town like Willow Creek, courage was often quiet, practical, and understated, and now it had been on full display for everyone to see. Meanwhile, the restrained intruder stood a short distance away, his shoulders slumping as he realized the seriousness of the situation. His frantic energy had drained completely, replaced by a hesitant understanding of the consequences of his actions. He had not expected anyone to intervene so quickly or with such control. Henry's calm authority had stripped him of the advantage he had hoped to exploit. The man's eyes flicked nervously between Henry, Martha, and the watching neighbors. He understood on some level that there was no way to continue his actions without severe repercussions. Henry's steady presence left him with no room to panic, no opportunity to act rashly, and no escape from the reality of his choices. Henry moved closer, maintaining a safe distance but ensuring that the intruder understood he was in control. "You've had your chance," Henry said quietly but firmly. "Now it's time to face the consequences. We can handle this safely, but only if you cooperate." The man nodded, almost imperceptibly, recognizing that resistance would only make matters worse. Henry's voice did not shout, threaten, or belittle. It simply communicated authority, calm, and clarity. It was a rare combination, one that diffused fear without escalating tension, and it worked precisely as intended. Martha, still standing nearby, realized that the situation was entering a new phase. She had survived the immediate danger, but she understood that the emotional impact would linger. Fear had a way of staying with a person long after the moment had passed. Yet she also felt a sense of empowerment, seeing Henry handle the crisis with care and control. She realized that bravery was not just about rushing into danger. It was about thinking clearly, acting decisively, and protecting those in need. Henry had demonstrated all of that in a way that left a deep impression on everyone present. The neighbors, too, began to reflect on what they had witnessed. Some had always thought of Henry as stern, distant, or even intimidating. But now they saw a different side of him, a man capable of immense calm, thoughtfulness, and courage when it mattered most. The whispers grew louder, no longer just expressing fear or disbelief, but admiration. "He saved her," one woman said softly. "And he did it without hurting anyone." Another added, "I've never seen anyone handle a situation like that. It's incredible." The collective realization was clear. Henry had become a symbol of steady courage, a person the town could trust in moments of crisis. As the sun began to lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the quiet street, Henry continued to manage the situation with care. He spoke to the intruder calmly, explaining the steps that would follow now that the man was restrained. Authorities had been called and would arrive shortly, but Henry wanted to ensure that the scene remained safe until they did. His presence reassured Martha and the neighbors alike. There was no panic, no chaos, only a clear sense of control that allowed everyone to breathe a little easier. Martha, her hands still shaking slightly, took a step closer to Henry. She wanted to express her gratitude again, but words felt inadequate. Instead, she nodded, a small gesture that communicated everything she felt. Henry gave a quiet nod in return, his focus never wavering from the intruder or the surrounding area. It was a silent partnership of trust, Martha recognizing his skill, and Henry ensuring her safety while managing the tense situation. The intruder, finally calm enough to respond coherently, began to answer Henry's questions. His tone was hesitant, unsure, and tinged with guilt. He admitted that he had acted recklessly without thinking through the consequences. Henry listened carefully, his attention steady, but his expression remained calm. He did not scold or shame the man unnecessarily. Instead, he allowed the reality of the situation to settle naturally, guiding the intruder toward understanding without escalating fear. The method worked. By remaining calm and firm, Henry helped the man regain a small sense of clarity, enough to cooperate fully with what came next. Soon, the local authorities arrived. Officers stepped carefully, taking in the scene, and quickly assessed that the situation had already been stabilized. Henry briefed them quietly, explaining what had happened and how he had managed to keep everyone safe. The officers nodded, impressed by the rancher's skill and composure. For the townspeople watching, it was clear that Henry had not just reacted. He had taken command in a way that prevented panic, prevented harm, and ensured the situation ended peacefully. Once the authorities took over, Henry stepped back slightly, allowing them to handle the intruder. The tension on the street began to ease further, replaced by a sense of relief that the worst was over. Martha felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. She realized that she had survived not just because help arrived, but because the right person had been there at the right time. Henry's courage had been quiet, calm, and deliberate, and it had saved her life. The neighbors began to disperse slowly, though many lingered to express their thanks and admiration. Some shook Henry's hand, others offered words of appreciation, and a few simply watched in awe, still trying to comprehend what had just occurred. The day that had begun like any other in Willow Creek had turned into a defining moment for the town, a story that would be told for years. It was a story not about fear, but about courage, composure, and the quiet power of a person who could act decisively in a crisis. Martha finally returned to her home, still shaken but filled with gratitude. She paused at her doorway and looked across the street at Henry, who had returned to his ranch. Though he remained focused on his work, there was a sense of calm and reassurance in the way he moved. For Martha, that simple sight was enough to remind her that bravery did not always need to be loud or dramatic. Sometimes it was quiet, measured, and grounded in a deep understanding of people and situations. By the time the sun fully set, the town had slowly returned to its usual rhythm. The streets were quieter, the neighbors had gone home, and the memory of the scream that had echoed across the street was gradually fading. Yet the impact of the day lingered. Willow Creek had witnessed courage, composure, and careful action in a way that would leave a lasting impression on everyone who had seen it. For Martha, for the neighbors, and even for the town as a whole, Henry's actions had created a sense of security and trust that could not be easily forgotten. The afternoon had started like any other, with the sun shining, birds singing, and the town moving at its usual slow pace. But it had ended with a lesson in courage, responsibility, and calm determination. Henry, the rancher across the street, had reminded everyone that heroism could take many forms, and that sometimes the most powerful acts were those that required patience, skill, and quiet confidence. It was a turning point for Willow Creek, a moment that would remain in the hearts and minds of its residents for many years to come. After the authorities had taken the intruder away, Willow Creek slowly began to regain its usual quietness, but the events of the afternoon left a mark that no one would soon forget. The town's streets, once predictable and calm, now seemed different, as though the small community had collectively witnessed a moment that reminded them of both vulnerability and courage. Martha stood in her yard, her hands still trembling slightly, reflecting on the experience. Though she was safe now, the emotional impact of what had happened continued to settle in. She realized that her sense of security had been tested in ways she had never imagined, and that the strength and calmness of another person had made all the difference in her survival. Henry, the rancher across the street, had returned to his work, moving among the cattle as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. Yet those who watched him noticed a quiet satisfaction in the way he carried himself. There was no arrogance, no need for praise. His actions had been driven purely by instinct, responsibility, and the desire to protect. He had stepped forward in a moment of danger, faced an unpredictable situation, and resolved it without escalation or violence. In doing so, he had earned the respect and admiration of everyone in the neighborhood. His bravery was subtle, grounded in practicality and care, and it spoke louder than any dramatic gesture ever could. Martha slowly returned to her home, pausing at the doorway to look back across the street. Henry's calm presence had been the anchor that held the situation together. She could still feel the echoes of her scream and the pounding of her heart, but she also felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. The knowledge that someone nearby had the skill, courage, and patience to protect her was both humbling and reassuring. For Martha, this was a moment of profound learning. Bravery was not always loud or visible to everyone, but it could be life-saving when needed most. The neighbors, too, continued to talk quietly among themselves. Some had gone back to their homes, but others lingered, discussing the events with a mixture of awe and reflection. "He didn't panic once," one woman said. "He didn't rush or make it worse. He just stayed calm and handled everything," another replied. The townspeople marveled not just at what Henry had done, but at how he had done it. It was a lesson in composure, courage, and responsibility, and it resonated deeply with the community. For a town that had never experienced anything like this, it was a reminder of how ordinary people could rise to extraordinary challenges. As the evening approached, the sky painted itself in shades of orange and pink, casting long shadows across the quiet street. Martha sat on her porch, sipping tea and reflecting on the events of the day. Her thoughts wandered through the moments of fear, panic, and uncertainty, and then returned to Henry's steady presence. She realized that she had been given a gift, not just safety, but an example of how courage and calmness could shape a situation for the better. She felt a deep sense of respect for him and a desire to honor the lesson he had provided. Henry, meanwhile, continued his evening chores on the ranch. He moved deliberately, checking fences, ensuring the cattle were secure, and performing tasks that had become second nature to him over decades of work. There was a quiet satisfaction in his movements, a sense that he had done what was right and necessary without seeking recognition. The town had witnessed his actions, and while some had already begun to talk about him with admiration, Henry did not seek attention. His focus remained on his work, his responsibility, and the quiet understanding that courage often existed in the spaces between words, in the actions taken when it mattered most. Word of the day's events spread through Willow Creek quickly. By nightfall, the story of Martha's scream, the intruder, and Henry's composed intervention had become a topic of conversation in nearly every home. People retold the events with a mixture of astonishment and admiration, emphasizing the calmness and careful thinking that had prevented tragedy. Parents shared the story with their children, not to frighten them, but to illustrate the importance of courage, patience, and quick thinking. The lesson was clear. Even in the face of fear and uncertainty, calm action could change the outcome of any situation. Martha's life, too, began to change in subtle ways. Though she continued her routine as a schoolteacher, she carried with her a renewed sense of awareness and appreciation for the people around her. She realized that safety was a combination of vigilance, community, and the presence of those willing to act when necessary. Henry had shown her that heroism was not always about physical strength or dramatic gestures, but about patience, observation, and decisive action. It was a lesson she would carry with her for the rest of her life, one that shaped how she interacted with others and how she approached moments of fear or uncertainty. The intruder, after being taken into custody, faced the consequences of his actions. The authorities were able to handle the situation because Henry had ensured that no harm came to Martha or anyone else. His intervention had prevented the incident from escalating into something far more dangerous. The town understood that what could have been a frightening and harmful event had been resolved through calmness, courage, and careful planning. For Willow Creek, this was not just a story of fear. It was a story of hope, resilience, and the quiet power of human courage. Neighbors began to see Henry differently. The rancher who had seemed distant, stern, or intimidating now appeared as a pillar of the community. People admired not just his physical presence, but his ability to act decisively under pressure, to assess a situation quickly, and to protect others with minimal risk. Conversations among residents reflected a new understanding of what it meant to be brave, responsible, and reliable. For many, it was a reminder that true courage was not always about dramatic gestures, but about steady, thoughtful action in critical moments. As days turned into weeks, the events of that afternoon remained fresh in the minds of Willow Creek's residents. Children who had watched from behind their parents' legs began to retell the story at school, not to frighten each other, but to admire the calmness and bravery they had witnessed. Parents shared the story with friends and neighbors, emphasizing the importance of staying calm and thinking carefully when facing fear. Martha continued her teaching, but she carried with her a new perspective on courage, community, and the value of presence in moments of uncertainty. Henry returned to his routine on the ranch, continuing to tend to his cattle, repair fences, and maintain his land. Life seemed to return to normal, but there was a subtle shift in how people regarded him. They watched him with newfound respect, aware that the calm, steady man who had always lived across the street from Martha had been capable of extraordinary courage. His actions had reminded everyone that heroism often existed quietly, in the background, and that the true measure of character was revealed in the moments when others depended on you most. Martha, reflecting on the events of that day, began to understand the deeper meaning of what had happened. Her fear had been real, intense, and overwhelming, but the courage she witnessed in Henry had shown her that fear could be managed and overcome. She realized that people's actions, driven by skill, patience, and responsibility, could change outcomes in ways that words alone could never achieve. The afternoon had been a turning point in her life, teaching her about trust, bravery, and the quiet strength that exists in ordinary people. The town of Willow Creek had also changed in subtle ways. Neighbors who had once viewed each other casually now held a deeper appreciation for their community and the people within it. The story of Henry's intervention became a shared memory, a reminder that courage and composure could prevent tragedy and inspire trust. The incident had left a lasting impression, reinforcing the importance of looking out for one another and understanding that heroism can come in quiet, unexpected forms. Even months later, the memory of that afternoon lingered in the hearts of Willow Creek's residents. Whenever someone passed by Martha's house or saw Henry on his ranch, they remembered the day when a scream echoed across the street and ordinary courage had turned a terrifying situation into a story of hope and resilience. The lessons of calm, patience, and decisive action became part of the town's collective memory, shaping how people approached fear, uncertainty, and community responsibility. For Martha, life returned to a sense of normalcy, but she carried the experience with her always. She appreciated her neighbors, valued her safety, and respected the quiet courage of the people around her. Henry's actions had not only protected her physically, but had also inspired her emotionally, reminding her that bravery could exist in quiet, deliberate actions. It was a lesson she would share with her students, friends, and family, ensuring that the story of that extraordinary afternoon would continue to teach and inspire. In the end, the scream that had echoed across Willow Creek became more than just a moment of fear. It became a symbol of courage, presence, and the difference one person could make when they acted with calmness, clarity, and responsibility. Henry had shown that heroism was not about dramatic gestures, but about careful action, steady judgment, and the willingness to step forward when it mattered most. For Martha, the neighbors, and the entire town, that afternoon became a story of hope, courage, and the quiet power of human kindness. The town of Willow Creek would remember that day for generations, not as a day of fear, but as a day when bravery, calmness, and careful action changed the course of events. Henry returned to his life on the ranch, humble and quiet, but the legacy of his courage remained etched in the memories of everyone who had witnessed it. And for Martha, that one ordinary afternoon, transformed by extraordinary calm and courage, became a reminder that hope, strength, and bravery could always be found, even in the most unexpected moments.